A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So, 3 newer Sonic the Hedgehog games, and I might as well get to the latest installment that we have at this very point. In October of 2024, came along a remastering / recreation. A Sonic the Hedgehog game that not only allowed for us to re-experience the almighty 2011 title known as Sonic Generations, but it also paved the way for Sonic's own rival, Shadow the Hedgehog, to make his own series of adventures through time itself. But wouldn't you know, this right here is actually something that I currently have at this point. And I'm actually going through this thing at this very point just as well. Ever since the game itself first came out, this, of course, is the Day 1 edition. It actually came along with a few unique extras. First of all, we might as well talk about, let's say, Sonic and Shadow Generations. The Adventure Legacy skin, which was basically when Sonic Adventures first came out all the way back in 1998, because 2024, that very same year, also saw the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Yeah, came out in theaters 2 months later. On the back, it also showcased a special digital deluxe edition upgrade package, which of course had itself its own code just as well. Finally, there is of course the Gerald Robotnik Journal, which is mostly just a collection of different scribblings and handwritings that he put together with all the notes in particular. So, just a unique collectible that came along with this. But, as you probably know by now, newly remastered and enhanced, bonuses, collectibles, and more, Doom powers, and a new story campaign with Shadow the Hedgehog himself, meant that this wasn't just any remastering that we got. No, this was the combination of the remastering of the highly acclaimed Sonic Generations, as well as the introduction of a new travel through time with Shadow being our new main protagonist at hand. After all, 19 years had passed ever since the somewhat controversial title Shadow the Hedgehog first came out. The Xbox 2001, the GameCube, they all saw themselves quite a release. But let's be real here though. A lot of things have happened since then. These old stereotypes that Sega's now been hooked up with the character Shadow the Hedgehog entirely being responsible for all of this stuff, it basically led many to believe that Sega wasn't exactly something that should have been made to appeal towards children. The kind of dark and edgy side of things sure were things that have gotten some frowned upon, but since then, don't you think Sonic has changed for the better? I know it has. Paramount would have made a trilogy of films based on the franchise's success, had they known that Sonic would apparently become a bad influence. There were a lot of terrible Sonic games that came along in the 2000s, not just Shadow the Hedgehog, but also Sonic 06, and a few other hit or miss titles as well. But that was the thing about the so-called for kids continuity. Of course, with the continuities that we have established since then, with the Smith continuity as I refer to it, which ran between 2010 to 2022, and since then, we've basically had ourselves an entirely new continuity. Anyways, though, if you're already familiar with Sonic Generations, there's not much need to watch this video. In case you haven't yet, then well, stick around, because for a few minutes, that's exactly what I'll be talking about. Sonic Generations, of course, is one of 2 games that you get to play in this title, but what it is, for the most part, it centers around a certain being that travels through time. A monster in particular that sucks all of Sonic's friends, and even though he tries to defeat it, he gets knocked away, and unfortunately wakes up in some sort of white zone. This kind of dimension in particular that's nothing but whiteness apparently is the embodiment of no color or life present. And because this creature is able to travel through time, it's uncertain whether or not color or life shall thrive. And even if it does, it'll take them away. Sonic, of course, is able to, in fact, blast through some old pieces of nostalgia. Two different act titles in both modern Sonic and classic Sonic's own perspectives, in which that we do have the option here to play through either of them in either of these act stages. Unlike how it was before, in which modern Sonic would blaze through the classic levels, which of course were mostly of the 2D side-scrolling variety, while the 3D blasting, as most people will call it, was mostly because of classic Sonic. So it's basically a role reversal in a way. Classic is thriving in modern's world, and modern is thriving in classic's world. The first time that we have modern Sonic playing through the game, he's able to blaze through two different acts of the Green Hill Zone. And eventually, he is able to rescue Tails. And this is our first character who is eventually brought back to reality with Sonic's help. We eventually do get to play through with classic Sonic. Of course, he is the first character that we get to play as in the entirety of the game itself, but for the main storyline unfolds, because we are actually meant to learn what we're up against here. We're up against two different forms of the game itself, with two different versions of Sonic, and two different versions of the levels taking place. So, if you try to wrap your head around all that and put the math together in your head, then that's certainly one heck of a conundrum to play through. And on top of that, there's a lot of time travel, so the numbers keep really adding up from there. So, after going through the Green Hill Zone and rescuing Tails, they eventually do start talking about certain things that have unfolded. They find out that the creature is able to manipulate time and warp reality, bringing along the color and the life to Noah Bale. But because of Sonic's speed, he's able to actually restore life and the time continuum itself. And in turn, he's able to go through all these different levels, 2 acts each, of course, and rescue each of his friends from there. At first we have Tails, but then along comes Amy Rose, then Knuckles, then Cream the Rabbit, then Espio, Vector, Charmy Bee. You know, it's basically just a lot of the usual characters that we remember. Even Rouge the Bat is brought along back to reality. After Sonic is able to blaze through each of all these different levels with both acts themselves, regardless of which version of him that you pick, there of course are one more series of obstacles that get in the way. The challenges. You see, in order to unlock the gate to the final boss, you have to obtain time keys. These boss keys that are more time-oriented than regular boss-oriented, as some of the other Sonic games were like, are basically achieved after completing a series of challenges. And each of these challenges do put Sonic to the test in many different ways. They allow for various abilities of his to be used, but when it comes to challenges in the shadow portion of things, yeah, let's not jump into that right now. Because after all, when the story does continue to unfold and all the bosses are played through, we do in fact get to face down with classic Sonic going up against the Death Egg robot, like in the end of Sonic 2. And then of course there was also other enemies. There was Perfect Chaos, for instance, from Sonic Adventure, where modern Sonic goes up against. And we also are able to face down against some of Sonic's old rivals. Like I've said, there was a second act in which that classic Sonic goes up against Metal Sonic, like in Sonic CD, but the only difference on that part is that rather than it being a regular boss battle, it's meant as a rival battle in which that Metal gives away a Chaos Emerald. The same thing is also done because of the likes of both Shadow and Silver the Hedgehog. And with each of these different new worlds that we get to experience, with each of these different continuities taking place, you at first have the classic trilogy, which allows for Tails, Amy, and Knuckles to be rescued by completing 3 specific levels from the classic games. Then you have the adventure continuity, which allows for Sonic to blaze through 3 different levels inspired by Sonic Adventures 1 and 2, and the main boss in that prospect, of course, was Perfect Chaos in Sonic Adventure. And finally, you have yourself the 06 continuity. Yeah, not a great way to go here. But this does allow for Sonic the Hedgehog to revisit probably some of the worst days of Sonic the Hedgehog possible. The thing is, Sonic 06 was probably one of the worst things to have ever been made in the year 2006. And there were far better games that came out around that time as well, like Dead Rising. Need I say more on that part? In any case, though, after beating through all these different continuities worth of levels and rescuing all your friends from there, completing the challenges, getting the boss keys, and defeating all the bosses from within associated with these continuities, we finally are able to face up against the Time Monster itself. But I might as well talk a couple things about Dr. Eggman first of all. Modern Sonic is able to face off against Eggman with an impressively designed machine. And let me tell you, this was probably one of the longest boss battles that I've ever had to situate from within. I've ended up dying a few times from this battle, and I kid you not, I ended up wasting nearly 20 minutes on this fight against Eggman. Oh, but it gets even crazier from there because the famous ending comes around. It turns out that the Time Monster was a thing made by Dr. Robotnik, as well as Eggman. Yeah, I might as well mention real quick that classic Sonic is accompanied by Tails from the past, and the old Dr. Robotnik, long before he was given the name Eggman, had come around just as well. And both of these doctors, from the past and the future, had both come together to create a Time Monster. This guy in particular was no joke. And now he was basically showing off his ultimate power with the two Eggmans in control of it. But, of course, even though both classic and modern Sonic easily get knocked out, the power of the Chaos Emeralds, as well as the morale from their friends, even their rivals, Silver, Metal, and Shadow, join on in. Every one of these friends that Sonic have made so far, they're both powered into super form with the Chaos Emeralds, and they set off to finally defeat both Eggmen. Much like with the battle against Eggman before this though, with modern Sonic up against him, this also took quite a bit of time. The thing is, unlike with most other battles against Dr. Eggman, this is one of those where you actually switch between the perspectives. You have the 3D perspective, which takes place within the wormhole, and then of course you go outside the wormhole with the 2D perspective. You can simply use a button to switch between both of these perspectives. But of course you have to use this to your advantage. And also charge up in order to fling yourself towards Eggman's direction. The creature of course can be taken down with a good amount of patience, and also keep a good supply of rings on hand. Otherwise, when you run out, you lose. And you have to start from the beginning of the battle itself. That ended up happening a couple times, just like with the last fight, but in the same regard as how I wasted a lot of time on that part, there was also a good amount of time that I put together trying to take down both these Eggmen. But with enough patience and enough effort, I defeated the two. And man, oh man, was it amazing. To see both these Eggmen get warped away into the White Zone, as it's officially referred to. This is, after all, the dimension in which that Sonic himself was once in, before blazing through all those levels, rescuing all of his friends, restoring life to the present, past, and future in his own timeline, while sending both Eggmen away to the White Zone themselves. And, well, we of course can't end this off by saying that while Sonic returns to his 20th anniversary birthday celebration with all his friends, and allows for classic Sonic and Tails to leave back to their own point in the timeline, the credits do roll, and when they finally stop, we get the famous conclusion, the post-credits scene, which both Eggmen try to find a way out, and then argue with each other over a couple things, before eventually coming to the conclusion that classic Robotnik should go back and get his teaching degree. It's really impressive when you think about it. Mike Pollock is just talking to himself for a few minutes. And it certainly is one of those moments in modern history that just never gets old. Although, I can't really say that it's truly modern anymore because it's less than 15 years old. But then again, since this game came out less than 1 year ago, of course it's still going to feel fresh in our minds. Because we might as well make it clear that the voice acting is a lot different because they mostly got a whole new cast to do a lot of the rework for this game. I don't know what the problem was in not keeping any of the old actors around, like Roger Craig Smith or Cindy Robinson or Kirk Thornton or Quinton Flynn or Travis Willingham. But in any case, though, I'd say the Sonic Generations portion of the game, that alone was pretty awesome. But you know what, though? The main thing about getting Sonic and Shadow Generations was, of course, to play it the arch rival himself. He's right there at the center front of this cover. And if you can't already tell by the background in which that it basically encompasses the logo itself, the title card itself shows Sonic and Shadow with an X, by the way, since that seems to be the hot thing nowadays. X apparently is the new way to say the word and. A-N-D. Not even the and symbol itself in punctuation exactly covers it. No, the thing is, this game is basically made possible because of the reintroduction of Shadow the Hedgehog. He hadn't really been around very much in recent years. But even though that later on in 2024 he would get famous along with actor Keanu Reeves being the voice of him rather than Kirk Thornton, of course, Shadow Generations was going to be a whole lot different than what we saw before. This wasn't going to be anything like what we saw with Shadow the Hedgehog 2005. No, here in 2025, we not only tackle this world once again with the horrors that we saw with the Black Arms, an alien race that supposedly were responsible for forging the DNA to manifest Shadow the Hedgehog himself. Gerald Robotnik, the grandfather of Ivo Robotnik. Just think, we're not only going to get that stuff in the movie, but the game also gave us a lot more reasons to explore the world of Shadow the Hedgehog prior to the film's release. For Shadow Generations, there's no better place to get started with than the beginning of the game. We're basically set upon in cutscenes where I feel like that for a new title, they probably could have worked a little bit on the resolution / frame rate of this whole thing, but in any case though, we're basically launched straight into the action almost immediately, with Shadow the Hedgehog basically flying through the likes of the Space Colony Arc stages. If you're familiar at all with Shadow the Hedgehog lore, then consider the fact that Shadow the Hedgehog 2005 at first is being explored, and of course, we have our moments with Sonic 06 and many other things that Shadow himself has been affiliated with. For instance, after we complete 2 different stages with 2 different acts in them, making it 4 levels total, plus the 4 different challenges, then well, we're basically set upon with having 3 different boss keys unlocked in order to obtain the door. And once these keys unlock that door, it's on to the first boss. And I gotta be honest with you. You ever heard of something called the Bio Lizard? I first saw a Lego set of it, and I didn't even realize this game apparently brought along the Bio Lizard. And after looking into it, of course the Bio Lizard was an old thing that they put together originally for Shadow the Hedgehog. And in this game, it's no exception either. They brought it back so that way Shadow fights it again. But the main gist is that, much like Sonic the Hedgehog got trapped in the white zone, Shadow is now in the white zone. But even after defeating that first boss, what do we get here? We get ourselves a little communication between him as well as the leader of the Black Arms alien race. Black Doom himself comes to let Shadow know that in due time he'll be perfect. With all these abilities and new powers that he's acquired, Doom powers to be specific, after beating all these levels and all these bosses, he gains access to these new powers. And with each new one that he gets, it seems that Black Doom happens to give him more praise. And it seems to be the recurring theme, much like with how Sonic Generations came around. And of course there was Sonic Frontiers. There was always a recurring character that came around in these types of games. Even when I talked about Hellboy Web of Weird, for instance, it seems to be a common cliche nowadays. A recurring character in the game comes around, lets us know on our progress and how well we're doing, just so we have the courage and the strength to keep moving forward. This, of course, is no exception. But as we go further into the game, and the storyboard itself, there is one big detail about this that sets it apart from Sonic Generations. Shadow Generations not only happens to be based solely off of the storyline of Sonic Generations, but its gameplay style is actually quite similar to Sonic Frontiers. Yeah, you remember where it was in a 3D perspective, and you were following Sonic from behind, and it was an open world mechanic with some RPG elements? Well, the same thing can be found here just as well. Shadow Generations follows Shadow the Hedgehog from behind. He's jumping in the air, collecting all the rings, riding on the grind rails, jumping up, collecting keys to open up various chests to unlock collectibles, which we can find in our collection menu option. And on top of all that, the thing is, it does seem to blend both the 3D and 2D elements, as Sonic the Hedgehog himself had done over the years. And with Sonic Superstars basically merging them together to create 2.5D, well, it seems like that by this point, they were using Shadow Generations to become Sonic Generations 2.0 with added elements of the other games so far. And honestly, the way I see it, it's nice to at least have something that can combine each of these together. But at the same time, with Shadow Generations being a more original concept, it's no wonder. This still has hit pretty hard with the fans, especially when we're coming to the anticipation of Sonic 3, which came out in theaters in December of 2024. Anyways though, with every boss that we battled against, at first we had the Bile Lizard, but then eventually we faced off against Metal Overlord, which was essentially the evolution of Metal Sonic. Because by the end of Sonic Heroes, that's basically what happens. Metal Overlord was pretty formidable though. And I will say, much like some of the boss fights I've had against Sonic Generations and Frontiers, the challenge was certainly well inputted. And with a lot of different button combinations and commands to put together, you have a lot of abilities to work with. And the challenge is mostly there so that every time you die, it doesn't feel ridiculous or cheap by any means. But still, I can't exactly let go of the idea that some of the deaths were there because timing seemed like it was right there. Yet, either I was too late or too early. There's hardly any real means for timing to truly be a nuisance. But that's probably why we gotta practice at these things a little more. By analyzing the pattern and effectively getting our timing put together, of course we're eventually gonna get good at it. And well, I was eventually able to defeat Metal Overlord with enough trial and error. As for the third boss that we went up against, well, it's Mephiles the Dark. Basically, it's Sonic 06. This is who we come up against. And much like how the original had gone down, we had Shadow go up against the Bile Lizard, up against Metal Overlord, and Mephiles. But then, of course, there comes along the Doom Eye. This is basically the giant floating object that was essentially hovering over the world that Shadow was exploring. And all these rings and collectibles that we obtained and all these musical notes that we gotten, yeah, I probably should have talked about those a little more. The thing is that in Sonic Generations and Shadow Generations, there's musical notes that you can get by ringing a bell in the challenge gates, and they also offer some bonus material. By collecting these musical notes, there's the opportunity for more artwork and other collectibles to be gathered. So, but back to the storyboard here. The main gist of Shadow the Hedgehog doing all of this is not just restoring time to his own timeline and getting to face against Black Doom once again, but also because the safety and welfare and even fates of Gerald Robotnik and Maria, Shadow's own best friend that he's had in his time. Supposedly, he felt like that their fates could be changed for the better if he were to restore the timeline to how it could have originally been. Of course, we know that Black Doom wasn't exactly the reason why Maria ended up dead, along with her grandfather, Gerald Robotnik, but this was mostly because of what had happened. GUN was supposedly the ones who shot Maria to death, as seen in multiple continuities. I mean, Shadow the Hedgehog did it, Sonic X did it, and there was even a scene in Sonic the Hedgehog 3 that showcased Maria herself being killed by GUN members. And Shadow witnessed it shortly before being put into a cryogenic sleep for 50 straight years. Until the events of, well, Shadow the Hedgehog came along, and yeah, the rest is just not so great history that we've been taught by Sega. But what do we have here? We basically have one final showdown with another series of levels in which that we entered the Black Arm's eye itself. This object that's been hovering over was basically inaccessible up until the point where Shadow got a hold of Doom Wings. And let's be real. An anthropomorphic hedgehog with rocket shoes, now bearing demon wings. I don't know how much more ridiculous you can possibly get. You know what though? After everything we'd already witnessed by Sega, we might as well just let it go. Forever. They could come up with something way more crazy than this, and we wouldn't even come close to giving even a quarter of a diving darn about the whole thing. Anyways though, Shadow is up against Black Doom once again. After completing all these levels, of course he's going to have some challenge. But the main thing is that all this corruption that he's been dealt with, because him bearing blood from some alien race that Gerald unfortunately worked with at one point, of course this did result in a lot of things that Shadow himself had to deal with. But in the end, he used all these powers, not for evil, but for good. That's what he set out to do, promising Maria that he would definitely use these powers, not for anything other than the intention of letting go of his anger and dealing with his past. A very troubled past. Well, this definitely does carry on until the very, very end, where we do get ourselves quite the battle. All of these different powers that Shadow has unlocked, and all these key controls. Yeah, we have to press on the different buttons and move around with some evasion tactics. Just so the final boss can be dealt with easily. But I get the feeling that some people are probably not going to want me to elaborate too much on the game, because since it's still relatively new, not many people have played it, at least from what I've already gathered. Yet, this is still getting a lot of praise and a lot of regard for its ability to not only resurrect such a well-known modern-day game, but also invent a whole new variation of it for an entirely different character. One other thing I might as well mention about Shadow Generations is that he does come into contact with Sonic the Hedgehog himself, almost making us feel like that the tie-ins between Shadow and Sonic, as we had seen originally with Sonic Adventure 2, and eventually with Sonic Generations reintroducing the famous climactic battle scene between him and Shadow, set to Crush 40's Live and Learn. I mean, if you've seen the movie Sonic 3, that same song also makes an appearance. But I get the feeling that much like Shadow Generations, Sonic 3, the film, could probably not be talked about for a little while longer. So in any case though, this is quite a game that I played here. 2 games in 1 actually. But in the end, what we have here is something way beyond the ordinary. And I get the feeling that a lot of people are going to want to give me such a big score on this one. But comparatively, Frontiers did so much more than what the average Sonic game could have been capable of doing. It felt very different for what it was, but it still held on so well that it really did outlive the original vibe that we had gotten with Sonic the Hedgehog. And that was more of the reason why I gave it such a big high score. With Sonic and Shadow Generations, I'm probably on the fence of whether I should give it a similar score, if not any higher. But I guess we'll just simply do so. Throw some caution to the west wind or whatnot, and give it a 9.1 out of 10.1. The very same scoring of Sonic Frontiers, thereby making Sonic and Shadow Generations cut it right there. Dead center. So, I guess that's pretty much all I got to offer in terms of Sonic-related games. 4 different titles I've talked about, and I get the feeling that we're going to have to do things a bit differently. While this is not exactly a quadrilogy of Sonic games, this still did have itself quite the vibe that we had gotten of modern Sonic, unlike anything we had ever seen before then. It was one thing where all these Sonic games from the 2000s and 2010s didn't exactly get a lot of praise or anything, or were just flat out terrible. But we're more than glad that Sega, Team Sonic, and other such companies that worked on the more recent games have truly pulled through. And with the success of the Paramount Sonic films, starring James Marsden, Ben Schwartz, and Jim Carrey, there's simply no doubt about it that Sonic has truly pulled through from a not-so-great past and has truly moved into an entirely different paradigm shift. So we're more than confident that Sonic is truly going to be at his best since the old days. Probably even more so. Because let's be real here. So many more people are into Sonic nowadays. And it's fair to say, he's gotten way more popular and truly more of a legendary video game character. So, Super Mario Brothers, you better watch out, because Sonic has truly pulled through some dark times. Yeah. So I guess with that in mind, this conclusifies all the Sonic reviews that I'll be doing, at least for a while. But I'll see you guys with some more material later on in video games that are totally awesome. And as always, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.